Hi, Sally Ann here. Today's episode is part of Men's Health Week, and we're turning our attention to men's well-being and their relationship with food. So many of my clients tell me about a male partner, a brother, a friend who struggles with food. So I'm really pleased to have connected with our guest for today's conversation, which really will be of benefit to anyone who's sick of trying every diet out there but still hasn't got healthy food sorted. We'll be sharing what's missing. So I'm really excited to welcome our guest, Jeff Siegel. Jeff, it's wonderful to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you, Sally Ann. And thank you for waking up early, dealing with the time zone change. I really appreciate this opportunity to connect.
Thanks, Jeff. In today's world, eating, as you know, isn't as simple as making better food choices. We're surrounded by ultra-processed foods, constant messaging, and pressures that can leave us feeling disconnected from our bodies and unsure of what to trust. And while these challenges affect everyone, men often face additional barriers when it comes to recognizing, understanding, and talking about their eating habits and health. Jeff is a men's wellness coach, Harvard Teaching Fellow, and the author of Eating 2.0, who helps men break free from the destructive eating patterns and reconnect with their bodies in a sustainable and empowering way. He combines psychology, mindfulness, and nutrition science to offer a refreshing perspective on eating, one that moves beyond the rules and restriction towards understanding the deeper drivers behind our food choices. Jeff, before we dive into your book and your work, I'd love for you to share a bit about your story with food.
Yeah, my story really begins as a teenager, starting at a new high school and coming into this new social environment, feeling out of place and uncertain, dealing with all of the kind of usual things that I think we deal with as an adolescent. And that's when, issues with my body and food really kind of moved to the forefront. I joined the wrestling team, and my coach said I should get stronger and build muscles. And I looked at the other guys who were hitting the weight room, and I wanted to be like them. But I couldn't gain too much weight, right? Like there was also this message of like, don't get fat, right? You don't want to be overweight. And so it's just starting to feel some of these pressures, which I know, these fall on women much more often and in a harder way than I think that they probably fall on men. I think there's a little bit more leeway in the what society deems acceptable or attractive for the male physique. But that doesn't exempt men from feeling these pressures. And for me, they became really enormous, and to the point where my eating got extremely disordered. I was cutting calories and really restricting to the point where it was jeopardizing my health. And I actually had to drop out of high school for a little while to focus on my own healing. And so at that point on, I knew the rest of my life was really going to be colored by my relationship with food. And that kind of brought me along this journey, this academic journey, studying nutrition, studying biology, studying psychology, trying to really understand what happened to me. Why did my mind go to war with my body? And why was I caught in this crossfire of, other people's expectations of what my body should look like, and then confused by what are my own feelings and what do I want for myself and all of that. And food was just a tool to manipulate, to perfect, to control something in a world that felt largely out of my control. So I think that, it's my journey through all of this is what's brought me to this work.
Yes, Jeff, thanks for sharing that. I know many of our listeners will relate to what you're sharing. And part of my story started as a teenager as well, dealing with changes in my life with food. And it's something we don't necessarily reflect on. And I have found this with my clients. They don't reflect on it until they start having health concerns and haven't really considered why is it their relationship with food is so disordered. And just in terms of that whole confusion about what am I supposed to look like? Yeah, we in the West, we don't have that education. I know when I first was introduced to Ayurveda, the traditional medicine in India, I just loved the concepts of the different body types and doshas and how there is no one perfect type, that we have to look after our mind and body in different ways. So Tell me now how you moved into your work as a wellness coach.
Yeah. And I appreciate you naming the pieces around what should our body look like. And I think for men it's hard. I knew growing up for myself, right? The typical, male body was just what I saw on TV and movies, the superhero or marble figurines from ancient Greece or something that I had studied in school, right? And these are sort of the ideals, right? The ideal physiques that are muscular, that are lean, that kind of classic athletic mesomorphic, if not, overly muscled body type. And that was something I coveted because that was what society said that was what was valuable. And coming to understand that my body is this unique breathing being that has its own contours and shapes and sizes, and I need to learn how to respect those was part of this long journey. I think the struggle for myself was not about what to eat because I knew everything there was to know at the time about nutrition and macronutrients and micronutrients and calories, but it was learning how to really trust my body. I was so disconnected. I was so living in my head in this world of good food, bad food, black and white thinking, right? All of the things that I'm sure you probably see in your practice that are coming up. And I realized this was a problem that so many men face, and they don't even really realize how disconnected they've become from their body. Right. And I think for all the ladies that are listening, right, maybe a man like this who is smart, capable, very functioning in many areas of his life. But when it comes to his physical health or his eating, there's just this disconnect. And so that's really where I dig in first to help men get unstuck by reconnecting with their body and rebuilding trust. Because I think that's where the root of so many of these issues lay.
Yeah, it is so true. Again, we sort of hand over the steering wheel of our own body to somebody else to drive. And again, I think it's very much a cultural issue, which I touched on before, because what really struck me the first time I had a consult with an Ayurvedic doctor was they expected me to know my body. And fortunately, at that time, I had been practicing mindfulness for a few years and I could participate in that conversation. But that is what I find when I have my initial free call with ladies is that they haven't even thought about what is my body telling me. And I'm just really inspired, and happy to hear your story and how you help other men go along this path as well. So it is that awareness that allows us to get that longer term change and most importantly, that happiness and contentment that we all deserve. So, Jeff, in your book, you talk about our food environment sort of being designed to keep us eating. What do you see happening for men and women in regards to this eating environment? And I know you have some wonderful ways of describing the eating environment, so we could perhaps start there if you would like.
Yeah. Well, the name of the book is Eating 2.0, like how to eat confidently in an ultra processed world. But that kind of begs the question of, well, what is eating 1.0? And I like to say that eating 1.0 is really your default, right? That is sort of your default knee jerk, unconscious way of eating. And for most of us, that is just the operating system, right? The set of beliefs and practices and habits that we inherited. And who do we inherit them from? Mostly from our parents and our family of origin, and then also from our culture and kind of society at large. And that means that this gets passed on, right, from one generation to the next generation. But it also means that, for most of us, the default relationship to food is a little bit antiquated. It's representative of an era that doesn't really exist anymore, at least not in kind of wealthy Western world. And so eating 2.0, I, kind of joke is it's sort of like the missing upgrade that and we all, I think, need, is this recognition that we live in this unnatural environment that's designed for overconsumption. And that the old ways of eating, right? They eat less, move more, use willpower, follow the rules, right? Like they don't just not work, but they often make things worse. And so I really want to help people break out of that and develop a new relationship with food that is really honest about the challenges that we're facing in our food environment. And also that, you're not the problem, right? It's like, I want to be very clear. I want to remove any sort of, shame or stigma or feeling of failure, because it's so hard when you've tried, when you've been living for so many years, fighting yourself around food, to feel like somehow, you've been messing it up. But really, like, the cards are stacked against us. And it's like, it's really hard. It's really hard. And so I want to, give people the tools, the mindset, the skills they need to navigate this more skillfully.
Yeah. And it is so true. The food environment has become so complex. And I remember a little over 30 years ago when I graduated as a dietitian, we used to spend a lot of time helping people read food labels. And there was just a tipping point there where you just thought, well, no, I'm actually going to encourage my clients to start with whole foods. Sure, some processed foods are really handy to have to help us with food preparation. Maybe it's some frozen vegetables, maybe it's some canned vegetables or legumes or fruits to help us in between the seasons of the produce. But yeah, it is a minefield, and for anyone who's listening that may not be as familiar with that term, ultra processed foods. A few years back, there was an international classification adopted called the NOVA system to actually help researchers and practitioners like Jeff and myself talk to people about food. We have minimally processed food or not processed food. Then we have the ingredients that we add to food, such as oils and, say, herbs and spices. And then we have processed foods like the canned vegetables I mentioned, and perhaps bread. The interesting thing, Jeff, in my reading to look at the comparisons around the world with ultra processed foods, is that in Australia, most of our bread fits into the processed, but in many countries it's actually an ultra processed food. Really interesting. And when we talk about ultra processed foods, we're talking about foods made from ingredients that have gone through numerous processing. So an easy example for me, because I'm a vegetarian eater, is perhaps comparing a traditionally made tofu compared to a plant-based veggie burger that's been made from protein that has been derived at some stage from a plant source, but it's not actually a plant source anymore. So those levels of food even make the system a little bit more complex, but I think it's important for our listeners to understand those different types of foods that we're actually consuming every day.
Yeah. Here in the United States, I say that there is definitely a growing awareness
Yeah.
of ultra processed foods and some of the dangers, right? And without a doubt, right? Like, ultra processed foods are a risk factor for so many diseases, metabolic issues, inflammation, mood issues, depression, right? And then the classic things like diabetes, obesity. But as you're saying, it can be a difficult classification because a lot of things kind of fall into it that aren't necessarily unhealthy or terrible foods. So I often think of the term ultra formulated foods as actually being a little bit more accurate. It's not necessarily the processing, but the fact that these foods are formulated, right, to be irresistible, effortless, and endless.
Yes.
Right. And the food industry has these enormous budgets and the incentives to design products that we want to eat more and more and more and more of. And so they're
Yes.
hyper palatable, and they hijack all of our rewards circuitry. And so I think that's what really makes these foods challenging. And I think we need to go in eyes wide open, as you're saying, and learn how to read labels. I think that's all crucial. And the flip side of that, although I do want to caveat that I think sometimes pointing the finger at ultra processed foods and just trying to is sort of scapegoating what I see to be a larger issue. And that's why in the title of my book, I don't use the word ultra processed food. I use ultra processed world. And I'm trying to point to the broader environment, because it's not just the food, right? It is the relentless marketing and advertising, right? Like, most people see dozens of food ads every day. It is the ways in which these foods are packaged to get get us to eat more than we need to because serving sizes become blurred and confusing. It is the stressed out, sleep deprived culture that pulls us into this mindless munching because we're so busy in front of our screens that we're not even paying attention to the food that we're eating. And so it's like it's all of these factors combined that I think make eating so challenging, and the ultra processed food just being kind of one important piece of that story.
Yes, I totally agree with that because all of those issues, and I know you talk about it in your book as well, the fact that when we don't get enough sleep, we get an increase in stress hormones. So that's going to drive our eating as well. But I think it is really important to understand too that when we go down this path, it's not about following another diet. It's not about just simply following another meal plan. And Jeff, that's what concerns me a great deal, on social media. You still see a lot of these so-called simple solutions and quick fixes offered. And when you say to people, well, it is a hard journey, but in many ways, it's simple too. It's just being able to give yourself that time, what I call creating space, to just actually take that pause and understanding that by pausing, we actually become more productive. So it is a big mind shift, isn't it, for people to actually venture down this way towards, as you call, eating, 2.0.
Yes. And I think this is where it can be particularly challenging for men because so many men, are socialized to operate in this kind of performance mindset, right? Where it's about working harder, pushing through, no excuses, right? If a little bit is good, then twice as much must be better, right? Or the reverse, right? Like if it's bad, then we got to get rid of all of it. And that leads to, as you're saying, kind of all or nothing, black and white thinking, the kind of diet harder, right? But, food is not a performance problem. Food is not a optimization problem. It's a relationship.
Yeah.
And in that relationship, I think is where a lot of guys get lost because they just think that they can kind of push it harder and they can discipline their way into some sort of healthier eating. And you can for a little while, right? I mean, all of these things can work in the short term, but they often are unsustainable and they come at a cost. And that cost is still losing trust in yourself. And I think that's the one piece of this puzzle that really gets missed and is important.
And in many ways, you've touched on what is missing, and it is that personal understanding and that really intimate understanding of what our relationship is with food. And whilst myself and yourself and other practitioners who are trained in this type of approach can help guide you, the outcome we want for all of our clients is to actually become the expert in their own mind and body when it comes to their relationship with food. And that is the big difference between what we offer compared to what those traditional, as you said, eat less, move more approaches are suggesting.
Yeah, I completely agree, Sally. And that's the challenge of any time, you're deferring your own bodily awareness and wisdom to some sort of external authority and just outsourcing any sort of self-knowledge to saying, well, this person said it was good, so it must be good, or this diet plan says that that's off limits, so I can't eat that. So everybody who's listening to this right now, right, like even all the things that I'm saying, like please don't take them as some sort of absolute truth, right? Like I want you to test these out in your own lived experience, in your own eating, and that's really what's essential, as you just said. And then from there, the fine tuning happens, right? It's like, this is a relationship with yourself. And, I can offer some guidance in that, but I'm not here to tell you exactly what's going to be healthy or unhealthy for your body.
Yeah. And I think that's what so many of my clients say, is that this approach is really freeing. It's really liberating because in many ways, diets promise that freedom by saying all you have to do is follow me and you'll be fine. But of course, as you said, they're not sustainable for many reasons. But what happens when you get rid of that, oh, is this a good choice? Is that a bad choice? Rather than, I wonder what happens if I try something different for breakfast, or I wonder what happens if I have a little bit of chocolate after my lunch. it goes into that aspect which I know you promote as well, which is a very important part of a mindfulness practice, and that's curiosity. And
Mm.
what I love about curiosity in it, and it wasn't really until I started doing my small group coaching, I realized the power of curiosity because it removes the judgment. It increases the enjoyment, the fun about finding out what works for me as an individual. And I just thought I'd throw that in because I know you talk very much about curiosity in your approach as well.
Mhm. Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. I mean, curiosity is essential. You know, it's the beginning of my framework that I teach in the book, and I know it's also a cornerstone of many of your teachings.
Yeah.
But yeah, it really begins, and I love the question that you threw out, like, you know, wouldn't it be interesting to find out, or let's just try this and see what happens. You know, and I love approaching it with that humility and that beginner's mind of like, I don't know, you know, and everything that then happens after that is just data.
Yeah.
It's not good, it's not bad, right? But it's data, and from that data, I can learn something and I can try something again and maybe do it a little bit differently, right?
Yeah.
And I do think that's really how our eating changes, right? When we actually look at like what is the process of eating differently, right?
Mm.
It happens in these little moments that begin with this curiosity of like, what am I noticing? How hungry am I? And then what would happen if I eat this way instead of that way? And we kind of fumble our way forward. Right? It's not always clean. It's not always pretty. It's kind of messy. And, you know, you're going to dribble and spill something on yourself. And like, that is exactly, I think, the unglorious yet like truly wonderful part of this whole process. And it happens bite by bite, day by day. But over time, like, yeah, you kind of eat your way into becoming a new type of eater.
Yeah, definitely. And you touched on your framework. So it might be a nice time to talk about what you call your family of eaters.
Mm.
And it's what I call the drivers for eating as well. So could you perhaps take us through your family of eaters, Jeff, and how they work together or perhaps don't work together at times?
Yeah. So if you've ever seen the movie Inside Out, which I love, is, you know, fantastic movie about a little girl, and kind of zooms into her head, and you see somewhere up in her skull there's a little control panel, and then there's these different emotions that are kind of fighting for the controls of her behavior and what to do next. And you've got, you know, joy and sadness and all of these things. Well, I like to think of our eating very much in the same way. All right. You've got a family of what I like to call your inner eaters that are kind of alive inside of you. And these represent the lens through which you are engaging with food. And I know you talk about kind of the primary drivers, you know, what's driving your eating, right? What's coloring your perceptions? How are you thinking about food? And there's four primary eaters. And this comes from, again, my own work on myself and my own healing journey, and then working with hundreds of clients. I tried to really simplify it down to what I saw as sort of the four most primary buckets in types in which people relate to food. And one is that survival eater, which is really that kind of primal part of ourself, you know, that's most intertwined with our body and is paying attention to energy and calories, not from a counting calories way, but just this like from a raw sense of like, do I have enough energy present to do what I need to do? And this part obviously gets a lot louder whenever it feels restricted, and it says famine, 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 you know, high alert, let's save up energy as much as we can. And this is our survival eater. So it's very opportunistic, it's very impulsive. And then we have a pleasure eater. And I want to be super clear. The pleasure eater is not the enemy. None of these are, right? Each one of these inner eaters have both gifts and drawbacks. And they're parts that are trying to help. And sometimes they help in kind of conflicting, outdated ways. And that shows up as often these sort of self-sabotaging patterns. But when you begin to see yourself as a family with these four inner drives, then that actually frees you up to bring that curiosity to relate to these parts differently, right? And the pleasure eater knows something really essential, right? That food can be extremely satisfying, right? It can taste good. It can bring us joy. And that is essential because I think we should eat with pleasure. The challenge is that when this part gets caught chasing pleasure for the sake of pleasure, right? In this sort of hedonistic treadmill without any sort of guardrails, right? It's like the little kid in the candy shop, right? That needs some loving boundaries just to, contain that energy of joy. And so it's learning how to, come into a more healthy relationship with pleasure and food and emotions as you're eating. And then we have a social eater that manages, right, the relational part of our eating, right? So much of eating happens with other people, especially, if you're family and have kids, and depending on who's in charge of preparing the food, or if you go out to dinner, you eat out with others, there's pressure, right, at the table to share food, to eat a little bit more. There's all of these invisible ways in which we adjust our eating behavior based upon what the other person is eating or not eating, or what we think their judgments might be of how we are eating. And so the social eater really shows up to help manage all of these unspoken norms that happen around the dinner table. And then lastly, we have the strategic eater, which is more of that kind of top-down cognitive control piece, right? It tracks, it plans, it optimizes. And this can bring that important lens to our eating of reading a nutrition label and saying, oh, hey, there's actually way more sugar in here than I thought there was. Or, oh, there's some ingredients in here that I know kind of upset my digestive system, right? So it brings that strategic lens, which is really helpful. And right, if this is the only way in which we view food, it can become sort of a tyrant, right? And this can kind of lead us down that path of that diet mindset where we can get overly restrictive, overly obsessive and compulsive around what we're eating. And that's really just coming at food from this place of strategic eating without inviting in the pleasure eater, the social eater, the survival eater. So I think the place I always begin is to recognize that we all have all four of these eaters inside of us. And we tend to have one that we default to as our primary lens or relationship with food. Yeah, we can access all of them. So learning to step back and ask, who, right? Not what am I eating, but who is eating this meal? Is it my survival eater? Is it my social eater? And then how can I invite in these other eaters? Because each one brings a different piece of this puzzle. Each one brings some really valuable, important perspectives. And when we can actually integrate all of them, we end up with this much more robust, multidimensional, and I'm going to say satisfying way of eating. And that's really the heart and the essence of eating 2.0.
Yes, yes. It really is understanding those conflicts. And I know in my work, just being able to tune in to physical hunger is often the first challenge that many of my clients face because they've never actually considered why they're eating in the first place. It's breakfast time, I'll eat breakfast. Oh, it's morning tea time, at work and there's cake, I'll have cake. And it just becomes an automatic behavior. And I suppose it's what we call the opposite of mindful eating, that mindless eating, not being aware of it. And so I think once we tune in or try to tune in to what physical hunger feels like, we're then in a position to start hearing these other eaters or drivers that can be in conflict. And I often use the story, a client goes to the doctor, they find out that they've got pre-diabetes, their insulin resistance is showing up. And they go home and they're committed to, yes, I'll eat less sugar, I'll only have 3 meals a day. But they find themselves snacking on something in the afternoon because food has become a way to soothe stress. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's, going to food has been a way of comfort for centuries. But it doesn't have to be at the detriment of your health as well. But for many people, they just don't understand this because they haven't had the opportunity to step back and actually see what's going on or hear the drivers, as you mentioned. So, Jeff, in your work with men, are there particular eaters that are more dominant, or is it very much an individual sort of journey for each of your clients?
Yeah, that's a great question. It truly is different for everyone. And and I name these four inner eaters because I see them as sort of these kind of primary, almost archetypal
Yeah.
kind of energies that we all have, but the ways in which they show up, in my life, in your life, this is always going to be really unique. It's colored by your past, your history, your family of upbringing, the culture of food that you were raised in. And we all have, just in the same way that our actual families, right, have their own quirks and idiosyncrasies, and they have their own stressors and ways in which they get along or don't get along. I think this is true of our inner eaters as well. I will say broadly, there's kind of two camps that I see showing up often, where
Mm.
there are some men that really don't think much about food at all, right? Like it's just something. If there's something there, they just eat it, and then they just eat until all the food is gone, and then they just move on to the next thing. So it's a very sort of unconscious relationship with food until, of course, as you're saying, they start having some health challenges, and their blood work comes back and it doesn't look good, and they keep gaining weight and they don't know why, and their digestion feels right. So there's these warning signs. Okay, maybe I need to wake up and pay a little bit more attention to what I'm eating. So I say those people tend to be kind of stuck in this survival eater mode without really accessing any of these other eaters.
Yeah.
And then there's the flip side of that, which are, I think, men that are very much in this performance mindset, optimization mindset, and they're coming at it purely through this strategic eater lens of like, okay, I need to get 150 grams of protein, and I need to get X number of grams of carbs, but I can't have too many sugars, right? So it's like it's highly through this strategic eater lens, but they often then lose touch with their pleasure eater. I find that the classic diet mindset is the strategic eater that has exiled the pleasure eater, saying no to desserts, no to food that's not unhealthy, you can't do that, right? And that, as I'm sure so many people listening, and certainly all the literature points to how problematic that can be. So yeah, just learning to notice and name your inner eaters, and then beginning to map out their relationships, I think is really the healing work.
Yes, definitely. And as you were mentioning that exclusion of the pleasure eater, I've had clients who didn't realize in many ways the reason why they were so attached to their chocolate was that they had gone through decades of literally restricting it, resisting it. And of course, when the willpower runs out, when it just doesn't work anymore, then they don't want to give it up again. And that's okay, because chocolate can fit into a healthy way of eating once we know
Mhm.
how much actually is pleasurable for us. And when we eat mindfully, we might find on one day a couple of squares is enough. And that's very different. And I've had clients say that to me, where chocolate has been their go-to comfort food for stress and emotional eating, that I can actually sit and just mindfully have a piece of chocolate, not the whole chocolate bar now, because as you said, we learn to name and understand what's driving our eating. And by pausing, we've got that opportunity to say, well, which choice do I want to make in this moment? And that's okay, what we decide to do.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, mindful savoring is such an important eating skill.
Yeah.
And I say a skill because it's something that can be learned and practiced and improved,
Yeah.
and yet it's not something that we're ever really taught.
No.
I know my parents didn't teach me that, my school didn't teach me that. So mindful eating as a practice is something that I work on with pretty much every man in my coaching programs. And it really is the gift of the pleasure eater, as you're saying, to eat with that presence, that delight of the textures and the sensations and the flavors, and you have to slow down and you have to be present in your body. And so that goes back to getting out of your head and what you think you should be doing and or not around food, and coming back into the experience that's unfolding in your mouth. Like, that is truly where all the good stuff is. And it takes some practice. It takes some work.
Yes, and I've had many people say, "Oh no, I don't have time to stop and eat." And it's really interesting, working through that belief with people for them to actually understand, well, I say to them, when you're filling up your car with fuel, do you expect the car to keep moving? Or, what would happen at the petrol bowser if the car kept moving? It just doesn't work, does it? And it's the same for us, because our digestive system doesn't work as well if we're not paying attention, if we're not allowing it to do its stuff. So it's really important. And as I said, it is that mind shift. And certainly when I grew up as well, we did have family meals. We did sit at the table and eat. But I know in many households that has changed over the decades. So, yeah, it can be challenging when I'm working with clients to say, okay, we're going to go back to family meals, because it becomes an awkward situation where the family all sits around the television watching TV while they're eating. And you've got your client who wants to sit and eat mindfully. You know, do they eat by themselves or what do they do? So there's lots of little changes that benefit the family as well, and lots of negotiations, and just remembering that mindful eating doesn't have to be 100% of the time. It's understanding how to tap into that and work at making it a more natural way of eating for you. And that whole concept of perfect doesn't really have a place with this approach. It's more about doing the best you can in that situation.
Yeah, I agree. It's important that we don't hold ourselves to unrealistic standards of perfection,
Yeah.
right? In any of this work. And that's a theme that I repeat over and over in the book, right? It's like presence over perfection. And it's those little moments of dropping into presence as we're eating, right? It's not like sitting like a monk in total silence and taking 3 hours to eat your one piece of chocolate, right? It's just like as you're eating, and I notice this in myself as I'm having dinner and maybe I'm shoveling food in a little bit faster than I want, but then, that awareness pops up and I just pause for a second and I just chew a little bit more, or I just smell the food a little bit more. Right. And it's just like, oh, in like that little moment is a gift.
That's right.
And those tiny little things really do add up and make a difference. And again, it's hard, I think, just because the cultural masculinity script, keeps telling men to just push through, right? And if you have discomfort, ignore it. And when it comes to food, you got to just, you're just there to optimize it. And everything is, again, this sort of like overly achievement, success, winning, focus kind of way of thinking about the body and eating. And that just unfortunately like really doesn't work. It just completely eliminates all of the softer, ways in which our body speaks to us. And so I think it's hard because men often then equate those things with it's being feminine, and then being feminine is being weak. And I never want to be seen as weak because then that questions or threatens my masculinity. And yet, the act of eating itself is an act of reception, right? Like it is about receiving. It is this yin process, right? There is a inherent sort of feminine quality to bringing something into our bodies. And so men need to learn to recognize that we all have that energy in us, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with it. In fact, when we can learn to enjoy it and to honor it, it actually enhances our experience and our health.
Yeah. Jeff, thanks for sharing that, because I think that is a big difference between how men and women approach their health and taking care of their bodies. So it gives us women an understanding of that extra challenge that men face when it comes to really being able to look at their relationship with food and set up something that is going to serve them rather than harm them in the long term. So thank you very much for sharing that.
Yeah, you're so welcome. I truly just want to help bring some of the invisible challenges that I think many men have around food and their bodies and eating, and make it a little bit more visible, because, nobody should have to suffer. And I think the more all of us can build that awareness and that trust in ourselves, the more we can feed ourselves in a way that is supporting, then the more we can show up for each other. And like, that's what really matters at the end of all of this.
It does. So for someone who's listening and has been feeling stuck in cycles of overeating, restriction, confusion, overwhelm, how does moving from eating 1.0 to eating 2.0 show up in their lives? What differences can they start to see?
Yeah. The simplest practice, and I know this is probably very similar to where you start with, is, just pausing, slowing down, pausing and asking, right, like, who is eating right now?
Yeah.
Which part of me is showing up at this table or about to take this next bite, right? Is it my survival eater? Is it my pleasure eater? Is it my social eater? Is it my strategic eater? And just begins with that self-awareness, right? And you don't even have to change anything. We're not asking you to change the food that you're eating, just noticing. I really see that as the curiosity piece,
Yeah.
and in my framework, I have what I call care. So the C is curiosity, right? And then the A is appreciation, which is appreciating the part of me that is here right now.
Yeah.
All right. Like it's showing up for a reason. I believe every behavior has a purpose. But sometimes the purpose is based upon some fears or some, trauma or baggage from our past. So we need to then update it. And that's where the responsible part comes in. So it's like curiosity, appreciation, responsible, and then exploration, which went back to what would happen if I try this? Or wouldn't it be interesting to find out if I to eat this way. So I find that when you can really come back to those four pillars, that's when eating 2.0 really takes shape.
Yeah.
And at the end, what you end up with is an upgraded operating system that can both manage the complexity and the challenges that we talked about of this sort of food 2.0 ultra processed environment that we're in, but not from this place of relying just on external rules or counting calories, but on this place of internal trust of like, oh, I know myself so well, and I know the parts of me that show up when I'm eating, and that I am confident that I can lead them wisely in the
Yeah.
same way that I would lead my kids, right? It's like, it doesn't mean that I have the perfect solution. It doesn't mean that every meal is going to, be ideal or work out exactly the way I hoped, but it means that it's like I can trust myself enough to show up and make the right, best next bite.
Yes. Yes. And it just makes my heart sing because, as you know, that's the message that I promote as well. And yeah, we need more of us out there doing this work so
Mhm.
we can start to really be seen as an appropriate and caring and sustainable alternative to what is still being promoted out there as the eating 1.0 in terms of that restrictive
Mhm.
approach to eating, because curiosity is always going to win over control, and our mind loves to solve things. So if we give it a puzzle, it will want to find the solution. And when you've got those guidelines of either the drivers for eating or the family of eaters, then you're going to have fun and you're going to find your own solution, which is even better. So, Jeff, thanks again for making the time to join us on the Eating for You podcast. Where can our listeners find out more about yourself and your work?
Yeah, the best place is going to my website, which is Jeff Siegel Wellness, my name, Jeff Siegel, Siegel wellness.com. And in particular, I want to encourage people, up at the top, you can click on Eating 2.0. And then I have a quiz there, an inner eater quiz that helps you really decode your eating pattern. And it's a great short little tool to help bring some of that extra awareness to, yeah, what's your default relationship with food, and how does some of these different relationships between your inner eaters influence how you eat? So I want to encourage people to go there first. And Sally Ann, I love what you're saying about fun. I think fun needs to be a part of all of this work
Yeah.
because it should be, right? Like again, eating should be delicious and nutritious. It should be fun. This shouldn't feel like a huge burden. The moment it starts to feel like this, a huge weight on your shoulders, it means that you're not going to follow through. So like bringing a little bit of joy along with you is really essential.
Yes. Yeah, and it just reminded me as you were sharing that this sort of concept for me during my career came in my interest with Eastern nutrition, Chinese medicine, Tibetan
Mm,
medicine, and Ayurveda. And I remember reading in a textbook that a Chinese medical practitioner colleague had given me to read, and it was about this Chinese philosophy that if your mind thinks the food is bad, then that's how the body will receive it and treat it.
mm,
And it's the same. I have clients who may have this plate of totally nourishing food, but because they're forcing themselves to eat it, then it makes you wonder, well, how's the body receiving that? Because the mind
mhm.
is actually not that excited about it. So that's why I think the joy is really important. And also the forgiveness, as you mentioned, and that
Yes.
expectation around not every meal is going to be your ideal one. So thanks for sharing that as well.
Yeah, you're so welcome. And I appreciate you highlighting that it's going upstream, right? Like from the food itself. Of course, like, we need certain nutritious foods, but like it's really about who we are as eaters. And I've noticed in myself, like I can, as you said, have the most, quote unquote, wholesome plate of organic, well-grown food with love. But if I'm eating that from a place of anger, resentment, or if I'm eating that in this distracted, mindless way, because I'm also watching a screen, like both the satisfaction and the nutrition of it is going to be diminished.
That's exactly right.
And so,
Yeah.
yeah.
And it goes back just quickly, that story that was my own story, and I hear from my clients, I want to have a piece of chocolate, but no, I can't have the chocolate. So I go and have a piece of fruit, and then no, that didn't do it for me. So I have a sandwich. That didn't do it for me. I go and have some nuts, and then I end up eating the chocolate anyway. So it's like, yeah,
hmm hmm
you want to eat chocolate?
Yeah.
Eat chocolate, but eat it mindfully. So, Jeff, thanks again for sharing today. I know our listeners will gain so much wisdom from what you have shared.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. And for all the people listening, especially, if you know any men in your lives that could use some additional support and just taking care of themselves better, please, have them get in touch.
Yeah, I'll make sure Jeff's contact details are available with the show notes, and my contact details will be there as well if you want to learn more about the Eating for You approach and our resources and programs as well. So, if this conversation has resonated with you, please share it with someone who will benefit, especially during Men's Health Week. And as we've mentioned, if you want extra support, Jeff and my contact details will be available with the notes. Thanks again for listening, and I look forward to sharing with you again next week as we welcome back Tanya Grzeski to share tips for winter health. Wishing you a mindful day ahead.